Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Roundup. I am TJ Van Tol, and with me on the panel today is Paige Niedringhaus.
Hey, everybody.
And our special guest today is Benjamin Farrell. And Ben, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about who you are, why you're famous, that sort of thing?
Yeah. Am I famous? Who knows? I work at Adobe Design. I'm part of their prototyping organization. So I get to do a little bit of design, a lot of bit of development. We work on new and exciting things and try to help, designs forward with real, live prototypes that we can use. On the side, I'm involved in side projects that I don't finish, that I hope to finish all the time. But I also wrote a book. I wrote a book about web components called Web Components in Action. It's available at manning.com. So I guess the book might be why I'm famous, if I have to go there.
Leveling up is important. I spend at least an hour every day learning ways I can improve my business or take a break and listen to a good book. If you're looking to level up, I recommend you start out with the 12-week year as a system to plan out where you want to end up and how to get the results you want. You can get it free by going to audibletrial.com/code. That's audibletrial.com/code.
Is there overlap? Is Web Components part of your design work at Adobe, or is it just a total side thing that sparked your interest?
Yeah, no, it was a side thing that sparked my interest. This is reaching back maybe 7 years ago. I was working at General Electric, and Web Components were first starting to come on the scene. And we started using them a bit there for our design systems. And yeah, I was kind of hooked. So I just kept wanting to use them. So I try to use them anywhere I can. A big organization like Adobe will have many different voices. So sometimes you can't use the tools of your choice. But I've been pretty lucky being in a prototyping organization where I can just use any tools I want for the most part. And I'll use Web Components.
Cool. Well, maybe for our listeners that aren't super familiar with Web Components, could you give the 101 level, just set the stage for what those are, why your average React developer might care that they exist, sort of thing?
Yeah. The 101 basically, going back to the basics, web components are a set of standards, right? So there's the shadow DOM that prevents leaky CSS style. You can't reach in with whatever JavaScript you want past the shadow root and do whatever you want with the component. So there's a level of encapsulation there. And there's also the custom element spec where I can say, hey, this tag is defined by this JavaScript file. So I can create my own components that are defined by a tag. So those are the two basic standards that are comprised of web components. And you can kind of go on with some semi-related things like JavaScript imports and, HTML templates, but those aren't really, anybody can use those. So those are kind of outside of the whole web components core scene. But when people say web components, you might mean that those set of standards. You might mean the library, the helper library you're working with today, which is I like Lit Element by Polymer. Lots of people are using Stencil as well. So you might be talking about an ecosystem when you talk about web components in practice. So it's kind of a messy scene, I feel like. And that's part of the pushback I think web components have had over the years.
So Ben, how did you get into web components as opposed to the Angular framework, the React framework, Vue? What kind of drew you to that in particular?
So a while back, I think Angular was my last framework that I really looked at. I actually came from a Flash background, and I've been doing that for a while. And then we kind of moved on as the world, and I started getting to JavaScript frameworks because I need my code organized. So everybody starts out with jQuery. I was trying to get into Dojo a little bit. I ultimately the best one I landed on was Angular at the time. So I got really involved in that, and I kept finding myself having to do very Angular specific things. I was I could have done this in JavaScript easy or CSS easy, but now I have to do it in the Angular way. And I got a little frustrated with that. And I wasn't focusing on my business logic of my applications, and I was focusing on Angular related matters. So I got a little frustrated with that. And then Angular, it was at version 1. So that kind of started falling out of favor a little bit. And then the React was the next big thing. So I'm I could learn React being the next big thing. But I really wanted to go back to no framework development. And I did that for a while. It was messy as expected, but then web components kind of started popping up. And this was around the Polymer library days, before Lit Element, before all of that stuff. And it was pre-version 1, so it's still a bit messy. But I saw the draw. I saw what I was trying to go for there. So I started using web components, and I kind of held on for several years, hoping it would pay off. And I really think it did, because I feel like, right now, web components are almost boring to me, because I don't have to worry about web components anymore. I can just do the business logic of my app, and I'm having fun. And I rely on like lit element and some helpers here and there, but I really feel like I'm kind of doing, for the most part, vanilla JavaScript. So that's kind of my story, how I got here.
That's really cool. So you mentioned lit element. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's not something that I'm familiar with.
Sure. So it's reactive style programming. So if you're familiar with React, how there's the virtual DOM, and you make changes to the model, and it kind of says, what's the differences, and it will render stuff on your scene. What lit element does is it has two levels to it. So there's lit HTML, which is a lower level library that takes care of the diffing for you. So you take an HTML string, and you rewrite the HTML string, and lit HTML will do the diffing for you and say, this change, we have to re-render this, whatever. So you're not writing JSX, you're actually writing like HTML in template literal strings. And it's really tiny library. It doesn't have that big, massive VDOM overhead. So there's lit HTML. I keep getting confused. Lit element is the one where it's kind of an API that over the component API, the standard web component API. So it's kind of some helper classes. It's a helper class. It extends HTML elements, so you can go and do some nicer things. It used to be really handy when we needed to polyfill everything, but now we don't, because web component standards are standards now. But it does have some nice helpers, and lit HTML is kind of baked into that. And so, I was kind of against lit element when I first started using it, because I'm like, I don't want another library. I'm trying to escape this stuff. But then I started writing my own helpers, and I'm like, this looks a lot like lit element, and lit element did it a hell of a lot better. So I guess I'm using lit element.
That happens.
Yep.
Actually, you brought up the sort of standard support. Is it like, what is standard support like in the web browser world? Because you mentioned like no polyfills. Are you at a point where if you wanted to use these specs, like, are you totally in like the polyfill free zone? Are there certain browsers you still have to be worried about? What's the status with that nowadays?
You should worry about IE 11, and that's about it. Because so even Microsoft Edge was the last holdout in terms of evergreen browsers. So like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, we're all good now. There's some parts of the web component spec that kind of died out, especially with Safari. But the core things that we use today, you can use everywhere except IE 11. And Edge, we can use them there because it's Chromium Edge now.
Okay. Cool. And so then I think my next question is, so you mentioned using some of these libraries and custom elements and such without any framework. Do you think it's a common thing to be using web components like as an alternative to a framework? Or do you see people like using custom elements, web components on top of something like Angular or React? Like I'm guessing, like, so my question's sort of two parts. Like, what do you see the most common approach out there? And sort of, would you recommend people try like web components inside of something like React, or do you think it should be like a clean break and just say try it as a completely alternate approach?
I mean, personally, like I think you should try it as a clean break, but I don't know if my curmudgeonly view is the most popular one. When I was writing the book, I was very gearing it towards doing plain vanilla JavaScript, no frameworks, and I still stand by that. I've kind of let lit element creep into it as a helper library, but I really enjoy doing no framework development. However, if you really like React and Angular and Vue, it's harder to get stuff working in React. And I don't use React, so I have a hard time articulating why. It's kind of the whole like props versus attributes situation, I believe, how React handles some of that stuff. But for some of the frameworks like Angular and Vue, you can just make a custom web component, drop it in as a normal DOM element, and it'll work. And what was I going to say? If you're using like Vue components, like one example I always go to is really complicated things. Like if you're building a Vue application and maybe you need some sort of like crazy thing to display 3D models, go to Google's Model Viewer, drop that web component into your Vue application, build up a UI around that in Vue. That's just fine. But you're kind of mixing in this native web component with a bunch of your UI. So, and all that 3D stuff is encapsulated in that model viewer component, and you can just use it. So there's mixed approaches, and yeah, I think it's your mileage. Like a bunch of organizations, including Adobe, they're going to have a ecosystem of whatever framework, be it React or whatever, and it's hard to inject a new here, just use web components into this stuff we've been using for years and years and years. So I think it's going to be incremental in some places as well. So it's just all over the place, I feel like.
I have experience with injecting a web component library into a React application, and it wasn't so much that it was difficult to get it to work together, but it was almost impossible to actually test it. Like writing unit tests, integration tests, those were extremely, extremely painful. Being able to access stuff in the DOM. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a great set of tooling. I don't know if you've heard of OpenWC, but they've been doing a great job in terms of creating some tooling, creating some building. I've been using ES Dev Server to serve my bundleless, buildless applications, which is now under the umbrella Modern Web. So they have Web Dev Server. But yeah, there's Google is kind of handling the library helper side with their end Polymer, and then OpenWC is a big thing in the community just to handle all the tooling and stuff, and they've been doing a great job.
Yeah, I know one case, one sort of use case for web components I've heard of, and Paige, I think you've mentioned you're doing something similar to this, is at a company level, building things as web components so that they can be used in multiple apps regardless of the frameworks being used. Because I know you even mentioned this at Adobe too. Lots of times technology decisions are sort of dependent on the team and what they're building. And it's quite common to have a bit of Angular, a bit of Vue, a bit of jQuery, a little bit of everything. So I can see that being kind of compelling, just being able to drop something in and say well, it doesn't matter which framework you chose 5 years ago or whatever. We know this is going to work for you.
So that was our goal at GE when I was doing the design system work. Everybody was using different, even back then, it was around 2012 or so. Even React was just we don't know about React. It's just something new. But everybody was using it, and everybody's fighting with Angular and React. So we're let's do some web components. Everybody can use the web components. Doesn't matter what framework you use for your end application. So that was our goal there, and I think it worked until they closed that team down.
So Ben, what are some of the things that you've gotten to do as part of Adobe's prototyping team with web components? That sounds like a really cool team to be on. And I'm curious, what kind of cutting edge stuff do you get to try out?
I will speak generally because I can't think of anything. The problem with prototyping is we're prototyping things that may or may not work out, and they evolve into different things. So even the stuff that's launched due to my prototyping, I'm not sure what I can say. So what I will say is, generally speaking, I've been doing a lot of kind of mixing canvas-based stuff, whether it's 3D or 2D canvas. You think Photoshop is a general example. You have a canvas. I've been, making a canvas web component or a 3D canvas web component, and then building a 2D UI around that. So that's kind of my go-to these days because I really enjoy building 3D or canvas drawing-based applications. And so you can. It's kind of a cool world because you're taking this canvas-based thing. You can do that just vanilla JavaScript because you don't need declarative UI there. You're just interacting with a canvas, so it's perfect for a web component. You throw all this complexity there, whether it be a 3D engine, and you just deal with it from the outside. You don't worry about all those internals, and then you build the 2D UI around it with lit elements and just plain old CSS and HTML, and it's kind of nice working with. Yeah. I'm trying to think. Yeah, even the stuff we've launched publicly, when I say launch, I did something with the De Young Museum last year that was web component based, and it was for an installation that we're letting kids play around with. But it was a one night thing, so I can't even share that.
Oh, that's a shame that it doesn't live somewhere now.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm curious about with web components, curious your perspective on it. They've been around for a long time. I want to say back in even 2012, 2013, we first started hearing of web components.
Yeah.
And I'd say when they were first introduced, they were brought up as this grandiose, it's going to revolutionize the web. Everybody's going to be using it. Mm-hmm. And I'd say nowadays, it's probably more of like a niche, like decent sized niche, but it's like there are more people using, say, like React and Angular and Vue than there are web components. And I'm curious, like your perspective on that. Like, do you think like web components are going to like grow over time? Do you think there's something like holding them back? Like some reason people are choosing things like React today more than just say, I'm going to build my next app specifically with web components. Do you see that sort of shifting over time?
I think it will. I think the big trouble, I think that what React and similar ecosystems have going for it is that they're a complete ecosystem. Like I can go to create React app and just like get everything working. And this is, I believe OpenWC has something like this now, but it's fairly new. But with React, you're just like you're not making a bunch of decisions on serving, on testing, on a bunch of anything. You just have the scaffolding set up for you. Web components, and this is kind of one of the things I like about using web components and just vanilla JavaScript in general. Like I have a bunch of choices. Like I have unique projects and I don't like all my decisions being made for me. So occasionally I'll have to cobble together some like workflows. And I think that's the problem that we're seeing, that it's not more widely adopted, because you can't just go somewhere to a definitive place and say, yes, this is exactly how I should do my application. I'm just going to read this and copy it. I think web components are in a different place. And there's some efforts in the community by OpenWC. The Polymer team is starting to put up a repo of best practices, kind of miniature best practices going forward. I don't think they've even started yet, but they're starting to put together the repo for it. So that's one aspect. What was I going to say? I lost my train of thought.
Well, I like the way you position that, because I totally agree. Because to me, like off the top of my head, just thinking if I were to use this, like I totally could see myself wanting to use web components on like a component basis, right? Like I need this individual thing to drop in. Great, I'm going to use a web component. But putting myself in the shoes of, I'm going to start a new app from scratch. The things that would be hard for me are things like, okay, well, if I'm using only web components, how am I going to do routing, right? Am I going to build that sort of thing myself? How am I going to manage the state of my app? Where, like, how is that going to happen? Like, whereas React, like, I know, like, there are sometimes too many choices out there for me to do that sort of thing. With web components, it's like I'm going into some waters where I'm not sure what's out there, and maybe there isn't something like pre-baked that I can just say, like you said with Create React App, where I can just get everything I need, sort of deal.
And the router is a great example of like something like I just don't get it. Like I don't get why I can't write this myself. Like I don't usually route my application, so maybe that's not a good example. But like using, what is that? Like I prefer like writing my own event bus. Like it's easy. It's not a lot of code, and I don't have to use a third-party app that I have to learn and have a learning curve towards. So there's these little things like routing, like passing events. Like I just feel like personally, I want to write them myself and not rely on other like libraries. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is true. Like the good thing about Create React App, like just to throw one example out there, is that you get everything. The bad thing about Create React App is that you get everything, right? It's so like heavy-handed, and which at times is great, but at times, like when you do have those custom requirements, sometimes you get stuck in that specific solution, and you don't have a lot of flexibility to say, oh, I want to do this instead. Or if you do, you have to like eject out of Create React App, which throws you into just sheer chaos. And so like it's the classic sort of, I think, software development debate, right? Like, do you use something that's a little more heavy-handed but does a lot for you, or do you use something lightweight and customizable? And I think it's always going to depend on what people are building, sort of deal.
Yeah. My train of thought came back to me, which is another point I want to make around web components, around like, will they be used in the future more heavily? I think one of the issues way back when was they were kind of oversold what they did. I think a lot of people don't want to like create a full-blown application without a framework. And so web components can be building blocks for them, but they were also kind of oversold in the fact that, we still have to use JavaScript for everything. Like there are standards coming our way where you can create the shadow DOM in an HTML file without any JavaScript, but there's still emerging standards. I think kind of how they were sold in the beginning was like, hey, let's just use HTML, CSS, all these web standards. We're not going to be complicated. We're just going to like make apps if you can do it without JavaScript, we can use web components and make it come together. That's kind of how it was sold, and that's kind of how it's veering, but we're not even closely there yet. I feel like we're still in the space of like we have to use a lot of JavaScript. We still can't import CSS files, so we have to like inline HTML and CSS in our in our JavaScript. So it kind of rubs people the wrong way. Like, hey, let's use web standards, but let's put all our markup in JavaScript strings. So it's kind of like a half-fulfilled promise that I think we'll get there soon, but we're just not there. And I think that like when people say, hey, web components failed, I think that's kind of what they mean. But standards are slow to get where they're going.
Have you ever wondered if you could be offering a faster, less buggy experience for your customers? I mean, let's face it, the only way you're going to know that is by actually running it on production. So go figure it out, right? You run it on production, but you need something plugged in so that you can find out where those issues are, where it's slowing down, where it's having bugs. You need something like that there. And Raygun is awesome at this. They just added the performance monitoring, which is really slick, and it works like a breeze. I love it. I love it. It's like you get the ray gun and you zap the bugs. Anyway, definitely go check it out. It's going to save you a ton of time, a ton of money, a ton of sanity. I mean, let's face it. Grepping through logs is no fun, and having people not able to tell you that it's too slow because they got sidetracked into Twitter is also not fun. So go check out Raygun. They are definitely going to help you out. There are thousands of customer-centric, customer-focused software companies who use Raygun every day to deliver great experiences for their customers. And if you go to Raygun and you use our link, you can get a 14-day free trial. So you can go check that out at reactroundup.com/Raygun.
Yeah, I almost feel like the Polymer project at first was sort of ahead of its time, because I remember trying it out years ago, and because it had to do so much in terms of polyfilling and use things that weren't fully baked, like it was sort of a little too messy for people to really consider for production apps. But I almost wonder, because web components, at least to me, feels like all these puzzle pieces are starting to be available, and they just really need someone to sort of coalesce it or package it up into something that people want. So sort of like a Polymer, like rebranded or 2.0 that sort of accepts that, hey, this is now in all browsers, and like pick the best for people to use. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, and I think like Salesforce by Lightning and like Stencil, like they all have those ecosystems there. It's just, I don't know. I like building my own stuff, so I haven't gone there. I like the freedom to build my own stuff, so I haven't gone into an ecosystem. But from what I hear, they're great ecosystems that are kind of all there for you. So in some regards, we're kind of there. But
and I had a question for you that TJ kind of mentioned when he was talking about Create React app. One of the main drawbacks to something like that is server-side rendering. That's always been a problem. You know, that's what Next.js attempts to solve. It's what Gatsby solves. It's SEO friendly, all that stuff. How do web components stack up in terms of SEO and server side? Do they work for that?
So I have never had a use for server-side rendering. I don't know much about SEO. I will say that SSR has been a sticking point of everybody piling on web components and saying, well, it doesn't do SSR. But in fact, I think, last I heard, the Google Polymer team was working on some easy SSR solutions. And I think like if you dig into the problem, you can do SSR. I'm going to throw out a term there, like hydration was the problem. I don't really recall. So it's out of my expertise, but I know it's possible, and they're working on easier solutions to get there. So that's all I can say.
That's fair enough. I haven't looked into it a whole lot either, because my own application that my team works on is an internal one. So SEO has never been a thing for us, as well as SSR. So we actually use Create React app. But I know for companies that are open to the rest of the world, that is a problem that they care about. So I was wondering how web components stack up.
Yeah, there's so many problems I just don't, I won't say I don't care about them. I just don't run into, because like if I'm doing a painting app, I'm not gonna server-side render it. So like it's not my daily like problem.
So I'm curious, for people that are sort of hearing about or thinking about web components for the first time, what are your sort of recommended like first steps? Like if you wanted to like tinker with them and say like your next app that you're building, is there like a good starting point, or are there things you recommend to like build or experiment with to try first? Like, are there certain components that you should sort of tinker with?
I would say if you want to go completely vanilla JavaScript, I guess I'll throw a plug in for my book. I mean, my book walks you through lots of different examples. You're building like color pickers, you're building like to-do kind of apps, all with vanilla JavaScript. So if you got my book, or at least just went to my repo that holds my code examples, you could see that even without buying my book. I shouldn't say that, but so you can start there. But also if you want to get in, like my book is kind of like divorced from any frameworks or anything. So it's a good intro to like standards based web components. However, if you want to get into more of the Lit Element side, just go to the Lit Element website, download their examples, figure out how to build like the starting application there. If you want to get more support, the Polymer team has a great Slack channel that everybody's super helpful on. I think that's where I'd start. Like I said, for more like, I just want to learn things, maybe get my book or even someone else's book. If you want to get in and just start writing applications in a super easy way, maybe just start with a Lit Element.
So you said that at work, you've been doing stuff with canvases, 2D and 3D. Have you been using web components for any other stuff like outside of work for just passion projects or fun stuff on the side?
I'm always doing passion projects. And hopefully, like I said, I finish them. This time, fingers crossed. I've been playing with TensorFlow.js, and TensorFlow is Google's machine learning library, I guess. It's super speedy. I've been using it for body pose tracking and facial tracking. So I can set up a web camera in my living room and say, and point it at me, and it'll capture all my body poses. And it actually gives you, even though it's a 2D camera, it'll give you a 3D representation of your head. So I've been kind of working on something where I'm interpreting the body pose points in 3D and mapping them into 3D space and using paper cutout characters like 2D assets and like mapping them to my body and doing pose capture. And it's a fun little, I don't know how old we are around here, but like back in college, I used to play Parappa the Rappa, very cartoon cutout style animation. Yep. And it really stuck with me after all these years. And I have something going with Babylon.js, with web components that is actually achieving that. And I'm hoping to release it if it works out. I'm always at that stage where I'm like, this doesn't look perfect. I need to tweak it, but it's coming along pretty well so far. So that's my big like side project right today.
I'm very nostalgic for that area of I think gaming, where like graphics were good enough to do 3D, but not good enough to do 3D particularly well. So yeah, it's like the box base, like everything was like a weird polygon, but it still kind of worked, and it was kind of fun.
It's kind of retro.
At the time. It's
kind of retro now, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Paper Mario look and feel kind of being in a comic.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's awesome. That sounds really fun. I would totally check that out if you release it to the public.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. It's lots. 3D. This is what I mean when I say like web components have just saved me. Like I don't have to think about them. Like 3D math is really hard, especially in this environment that I just talked about. And like, if I had to worry about like React issues, like I'd just be overwhelmed. And now I can focus on the 3D aspect of my application, just put up some 2D UI. I don't have to worry about like frameworks and stuff like that. I have to worry about the hard bits of my application, which is what is really fun.
So one thing I want to dive into with web components, because I know historically the term is meant like it sort of encompasses multiple different APIs, right? Because and this is where you're going to have to help me, because there's custom elements, right? Because that's the bit that just gives you component APIs, and Shadow DOM, right? Yep. Like to help like isolate things. What's the status of? Because I know HTML imports at some point was thrown into that. Is that something that's still a thing, or what's the status of that?
So HTML templates used to be the trifecta, but it's kind of dropped out of the trifecta as the best standard. And the reason for that is because we're hoping to import HTML. We're hoping to import CSS. We're actually hoping to import like, JSON or wherever you want. Like that's one of the things like when you're in that React ecosystem, when you're in that Webpack ecosystem, you can just like import CSS. You can import my image. Yeah. And that's not a web standard. So that is the dream. Like right now, if you want to put HTML or CSS in your application, you have to like put it in a string and whatever. So the status of that, I feel like it's been promised coming to Chrome for quite a while. And it's one of the situations I think it changes day to day what the status is, but usually the problem is like Chrome announces they're going to do it, but then like Firefox and Safari have to be dragged into it as well. So it's not here yet, and hopefully, I keep hearing promises about it. Like it's coming soon. It's coming soon. It's going to be awesome when it comes. It's just not here yet. So there's front end tooling like in my application today, like at Adobe, the prototype I'm working on. Like we are importing CSS, but there's some front end tooling behind it. So it looks like we're importing it, but we're not really. It's not a web standard.
And so when you say, just I'm clear here, when you're saying like import CSS, you're talking about you're in a JavaScript file. There's some CSS associated with it. So you have like some sort of import statement that like brings in the CSS that's associated with it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
There is what is the feature? It's adopted style sheets. That is like the preliminary feature for using CSS in this way. So basically, aside from what's that?
Oh, and that's the name of like the spec. Is that it? Like
that's the feature. I mean, it's in Chrome today. I feel like it's almost in Firefox if it's not in Firefox. But so adopted style sheets are this thing where you can import a style sheet, use a style sheet, and use like the same memory reference style sheet elsewhere in your application. So you can adopt that style sheet from different parts of your application. And so once we have CSS imports in there, it's going to use that same memory reference if you've already used it. So it's kind of like that situation where we're building up to this grand thing, but we're taking it step by step.
And presumably like once this ships as like a standard, we'll have things like probably like what you're doing at Adobe, right? Where we polyfill it because I'm sure it'll ship in Chrome and then it'll be like a year before it goes in Firefox and like 3 years before Safari.
Yeah. So if
I get to imagine
if you're using lit element, it's actually adopted style sheets are already polyfilled in there. So you're going to use them if their browser supports it. So it's not one of those things like it's probably not going to be one of those things normal developers even know about or say, I'm going to use this. It's just something they're going to fall into by whatever environment they're using.
That is kind of fun. I like the idea of just using whatever the standard's going to be for now and just rely on whatever it is under the hood to make it happen.
Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff I appreciate most, that I don't have to think about it and it just works.
Well, yeah, that's the stuff that gives me nightmares too. Like when something goes wrong, you're like, I didn't have to think about this before. What is going on?
True. Then you Google those obscure errors and find out that Stack Overflow.
Yeah, I mean, Paige and I were talking before the show. I was just telling her like my nightmares. I was just having issues with TypeScript and like stuff yesterday, and I'm still a little hungover from my problems yesterday.
Oh, so that's a great question. How is it using TypeScript and web components together? That's something I haven't heard about before.
Mm-hmm. I'm new to TypeScript. I was always kind of like in addition to my pure vanilla JavaScript kind of like mindset, I don't like TypeScript's fine. Like if it was a normal part of the browser, like sure, that's great. It's a great syntax, but I don't like having front end tooling, having to transpile things, and then it's one level of indirection or multiple levels of indirection. But in terms of web components and TypeScript, they work great. In fact, if you use lit element, web components are a little better because you can use decorators for like querying elements in your component. You can use them for properties and such. So yeah, I've really not had any problems with TypeScript and web components. The problems I've had with TypeScript lately are just like using third-party bundles or third-party libraries and having them be common JS. Because one of the things I like to do is not bundling, just like serving up my application, going buildless. So using ES6 modules all over the place for everything and just like serving up, just like loading the HTML and going to town. So, and that, the problems I was having yesterday is just like when JavaScript libraries don't have ES6 modules and they're using common JS and I have to like figure out, and that's where my problems were yesterday with TypeScript. But yeah, like TypeScript, I can't think of a single problem I've had with web components was in TypeScript. So I have nothing to say.
You're living the dream with a no bundle system, man. Like most of us have a build system that we have no idea about. Like got like a 600 line Webpack config that I'm pretty sure is like also tied into my like kitchen or something, because it's like doing a complete bunch of nonsense. So I'd be curious about just even that portion of it, like ES modules and such, just because like typically I tend to use just what React recommends, right? And like some of the default Webpack stuff. So does ES modules sort of play into like the same sort of picture? Like, is that something that's easier to use with web components, or how does all that work?
I think it's a favorite. It might be a favorite of the web components community just because it's a little easier to use and is kind of outside this gigantic ecosystem. So I think it fits the same mindset, but it's not because it's web components that we like to use, go and build this like this. So basically, if you don't use bare modules, if you're just like using direct imports references that, don't need any resolution whatsoever, you can just load up that HTML file in any server and it's going to work just fine. The problem is when you start having these modules like it's not a problem. It's a best practice, but it's still annoying that you have to use some other server for this. So I'll take lit element, for example. Like when you go into lit element, you import lit element from lit element, and you don't specify, well, this is in my node modules folder, and give a complete path to it. You just say lit element. That's where I'm importing it from. So it's going to reference something to look that up. If you just use a normal server, it can't look it up. So that's why we're using the modern web, formerly OpenWC's ES Dev server, or now Web Dev server. So that has a COA server behind it, and it'll do those module resolutions. It's super lightweight, and you can kind of mix in rollup plugins with it if you need any additional transformations. But usually, I'm just using it as a simple server, and it just does that bare module resolution. So it's kind of one step above using a normal server, but it's kind of really nice to work with.
Are there any performance concerns with that? Because I presumably then it's doing like a whole bunch of requests. Like if you have a large app, right, to resolve these things, are there performance concerns from doing that? Or are just modern browsers pretty smart to optimize that sort of thing?
So I should say that when I do go to production, I do bundle it with rollup, so that doesn't happen. However, I've heard I'm no network expert. I've always been in the habit of bundling for production, so that hasn't changed for me.
Okay.
I have heard people say like, well, it's HTTP2, things are cached. You can do this in production. I don't know that I've heard that for a while. I don't know if that's true or not, but for just everyday development, like your development tasks, yeah, it's completely fine. I've run into no issues with just, serving everything up as bare modules,
Yeah, we're gonna have to get I'm sort of in the same boat of you as like HTTP 2 for a while was heralded as, oh, you don't need to worry about combining resources anymore. But I hear like conflicting information about that. So we have to get somebody on here that like knows that spec in and out to end this discussion, because I'm still not totally sure what I'm quote unquote supposed to be doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think the standby of bundling all in one bundle, or like being smart about your bundles, with rollup or however you choose to use it, is the de facto way to go to production these days. But it'd be nice if we just use HTTP2 and like not do anything anymore. But I'm scared to do so.
Well, at this point, we've covered web components here. Is there any topic related to this that you think we haven't covered that we should get into about web components?
I will throw out, just a small tidbit. I've been following Web Component Bytes. So if you like news, and I don't even know who this person is, but I just subscribe to their mailing list. Web Component Bytes just gives you little snippets in your inbox every week of newest web component news and like tidbits. So it's a pretty nice thing to follow. But that's all I can really think of right now.
Well, cool.
Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just launched my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's up on Amazon. We self-published it. I would love your support. If you want to go check it out, you can find it there. The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. Have a good one. Max out.
So at that point, why don't we move into our picks? So Paige, you want to kick us off?
Sure. So my pick this week is actually going to be a website that I've been using a lot more since quarantine has started, and I've been needing to get more creative in the kitchen. It is called allrecipes.com, and they have an app. They have a a website. They've been around for years and years, and they've always been great. But I find myself turning to them a lot more recently because I just need inspiration of what to do with chicken and pork and vegetables to make it interesting, since there's a lot less eating out in restaurants happening as of late. So I would highly recommend it. It's got some really great filtering. If you put in, I don't know, a pork tenderloin marinade, it's got some great filtering, so you can find like the most liked ones, the most highly rated and stuff like that, which I find really helpful to determine like what's a great recipe versus what's just something somebody put up and they thought it was great, but nobody else really cared for it. So that's going to be my pick for this week, is all recipes.
Cool. So for this week, I'm going to pick not a specific thing, but sort of an idea. So we've been redoing parts of our house here over the last year, figuring, we're not going anywhere travel wise. So we've been doing some work on the house and such. And we did some painting, and we were debating like what to put up on the wall in terms of art. And like, I've always never been an art person, right? I don't know, like I go into like the art section and I'm totally confused, like, right, I don't know what I want. So we finally settled on the idea of just getting canvas prints of some things pictures we had taken from traveling to places. So just scenic pictures, and just went and we worked with a place local. But I know there's online services for doing this, of basically taking pictures, throwing them up on the wall. And so I'm just throwing out that idea for anybody who's struggling, like, what am I going to fill this wall with? Because it's kind of fun, because then the picture is a little more personal. It's not just some random thing you found at a store, but it sort of evokes a memory of, hey, remember when we were here? You have people over, you can tell them about, actually, this is a picture we took. So just an idea to throw out there. I don't have a specific service in mind, but I know there are places you can get like canvas prints of photos online. So something to consider. Cool. And Ben, do you have any picks?
I was telling Paige at the start of this, I didn't know what a pick was. So it's just anything that inspired you over the week?
Literally anything. I mean, I picked an idea. So.
Yeah. Right on. I have to tell you, I'll say what this is. If your listeners go to look this up, just be aware that it's, harsher language because it's by the South Park guys. However, I've been super impressed by what they've put out called Sassy Justice. It's basically it's deep. I think they created some kind of expensive studio creating deep fakes. It's super impressive. They're actually like taking famous people like Al Gore, like Trump, and like superimposing their images using deepfake technology over their own faces, their own actors' faces, and they created this 15-minute video using this. It's typical like crude South Park behavior, but it's super impressive just how well it's done, and kind of scary what our future will hold, that it is this well done.
Yeah, I've seen like you see clips of these sort of things too. And like, it's nice that now, at least for now, they're typically like labeled as like, hey, check out what this technology can do. I'm sort of scared in the era, because we're like one step away from people being able to like really question the reality of any video you see.
No, I mean, I think one of the reasons I appreciate this video as well is because it's all about using deep fakes. It's basically a fake news report about deep fakes. So that it's very in your face, like, we are using deep fake technology. Do not believe anything you see. So that's one of the reasons I like this. But if it was more subtly done, you'd never know it. It's just so well done.
Well, very cool. Well, Ben, this was awesome. This was a lot of fun. I guess to leave us our final question, where's the best place? Like, if people want to follow you, ask any questions, maybe if they want to buy your book, you want to drop us with some like links or places to find you and such?
Sure. You can always find me at benfarrell.com. That's my website. My email address is ben@benfarrell.com. And you can buy my book at manning.com/web components in action, or Amazon, whatever you prefer.
Well, very cool. Well, thanks for joining us today, Ben. This is an awesome conversation. And
thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Until next week.
See you later.
Bye, everybody.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.